Syllogisms, what are they? It's helpful to think of syllogisms as a diagnostic tool. Syllogisms help us diagnose errors in our thinking or in our writing, and therefore they're very useful. Generally, logicians talk about three syllogisms: categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive syllogisms. And I'll show you an example of all three of those. However, I'm going to zero in especially on the hypothetical syllogisms. Now, every syllogism has three parts: two premises and a conclusion. Premise 1, premise 2, and the conclusion. And this is what we would call a categorical syllogism, because it uses categorical propositions. Premise 1, premise 2, and the conclusion. This is what we call a hypothetical syllogism. Now, the point of the two premises is this: every syllogism asserts that, assuming the truth of the premises, the conclusion is necessarily true, which means it must be true. It cannot possibly be false. So if it's true, if Socrates is a man, then he is mortal. And if it's true that Socrates is a man, then this conclusion absolutely must follow. It is a necessary truth. The same here. If it's true that all men are mortal, if it's true that Socrates is a man, then this conclusion must necessarily follow. The third kind of syllogism is a disjunctive syllogism: premise 1, premise 2, and a conclusion. And at the heart of a disjunctive syllogism is a disjunctive proposition. But again, the important thing to remember is that syllogisms are effective at diagnosing errors in our thinking because they tell us that if both premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So let's look then at hypothetical syllogisms. And at the heart of a hypothetical syllogism is a hypothetical proposition, which is simply stating a hypothetical or a conditional. If something is true, then something else is true. So look at this hypothetical proposition: if theology is important, then students should study it. Now, there are two parts to a hypothetical proposition, which you must know. The first part here, which is called the antecedent, and the second part in blue here is called the consequent. Now, there are other names for those things, but we're going to stick with the common name, the antecedent and the consequent. So, every syllogism then has two premises and a conclusion. The first premise we'll call the major premise, and in a hypothetical syllogism, the major premise will always be that hypothetical proposition. So let's take a syllogism here, and let's look at it. So here's premise 1, or the major premise, which you'll note is our hypothetical, the minor premise, and then here comes our conclusion. And the minor premise here is always going to be either affirming or denying something in this major premise. Let's look at that. The minor premise is the most important part of a hypothetical syllogism because the minor premise will be either affirming the antecedent or denying the consequent. If it does anything else, it's an invalid syllogism and it's worthless. A valid syllogism affirms the antecedent or denies the consequent. So let me put up a syllogism here. Here's our major premise, minor premise, and our conclusion. Now, you'll notice then that the minor premise here affirms the antecedent, and that is what we expect. We want the antecedent to be affirmed. That means it's a valid syllogism. That means, again, to repeat, that if this premise is true and this premise is true, this conclusion must necessarily follow. Now, if one of these premises is false, then the conclusion does not follow. But assuming the truth of both the premises, the conclusion is absolutely necessarily true. Let's look at another syllogism here that denies the consequent. So here's our major premise. The minor premise takes the consequent here and adds the word not. That's the key word there. It denies the consequent. Here's our conclusion, and the consequent is denied. The syllogism is valid, and therefore, again, assuming the truth of these premises, this conclusion must necessarily follow. Let's look at some invalid syllogisms. Again, let's remember our rule, and let's put up the major premise. Here's a minor premise, but now notice it's denying, notice the word not here, It's denying the antecedent. The antecedent is denied. That is a bad syllogism. That is an invalid syllogism. That syllogism is absolutely useless. Another invalid syllogism. Notice that the minor premise here affirms the consequent. It affirms the consequent. Again, the consequent is affirmed, but we remember that the minor premise must either affirm the antecedent or deny the consequent, and therefore this syllogism as well is absolutely useless. The important thing to remember then when working with hypothetical syllogisms, as I've said a number of times already, the minor premise must either affirm the antecedent or deny the consequent, and an easy way to remember that is to think of AADC, affirm the antecedent or deny the consequent. If you can keep this rule in your mind, you'll always be able to use the hypothetical syllogism effectively to diagnose errors in your thinking.